I wanted the soundtrack for Ghost of Tsushima to have the same authenticity that the game makers, that Sucker Punch, were going for in the creation of the game. And so what this meant was giving myself the challenge of trying to really understand how Japanese music was created, and I started having to study that and research that, the tonality, the scales they used, the instruments, and how to write for those instruments. At some points I felt like I'd bitten off more than I could chew. It was an awful lot to learn. And now, of course, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I know just enough to know how little I know. I started looking at other composers, Japanese composers who had worked in a European style, like Takemitsu. What was interesting looking at his work is he said that the traditions were so different from the traditional Japanese instruments to the Western instruments that it wasn't really possible to write for them together. And if you listen to his work, you see he does something classical and then he does something Japanese, and he alternates between the two. It doesn't often combine them. First of all, I went to folk music from the island of Tsushima. I started learning those themes, and when I started to understand how those melodies had been written, I then started trying to write my own melodies in a similar style with 5-note scales. There are typically two main scales that were being used, and I started trying to write my own themes, and that felt very tricky because typically we're working with the chromatic 12-note scale, and suddenly I was just limited to 5 notes. But limitations are the mother of creation often, and so you're forced into being inventive with the limited tools that you have. So that was great, and what it also meant is that I could then write music that the instruments, shakuhachi, koto, would be able to play. And then I had to understand, well, the shakuhachi, you can overblow that, so it can play a semitone up from its main notes, or the koto, you can bend the strings, so you've got a little bit of leeway around those notes as well. And then how to incorporate the Western orchestra. Well, I thought I really wanted the Japanese instruments to be the stars, to be the focal point, and for the orchestra to play a subservient role to them. And so I decided that I would only use those 5 notes from the two different types of scales in the creation of the music with the orchestra. That again was limiting. In Japanese music, there isn't a tradition of chords, of vertical harmony in the way that we have in Western music. And so I created a system of chords that were built out of the 5-note scales so that I could remain authentic to the pentatonic scales, but still have a system of chords that I could use. And then that allowed me to not only have melodies, but to have chords in the pieces of music. Once I created all these rules for myself, of course there were moments where I decided to break the rules, because what's the fun in a rule if you can't break it? But in particular, the main theme of Ghost, the way of the Ghost, that I am really pleased with the way that came out, because that has great purity of thought in it. It only has those 5 notes of that particular scale in it. The whole thing is only made up from that pentatonic scale. And so it's just as easy to play on traditional Japanese instruments as it is to play in the orchestra. And so it has a very singular idea behind it, and it's very true to itself as a piece of music. When I wrote it, it was amongst the first things that I wrote for Ghost, and we parked all those ideas to one side, and I wrote lots of other things, and it was many months later that we revisited it. And from that first go-round, as is often part of my working process, a lot of those things end up on the cutting room floor. The first idea isn't always the thing that sticks, you have to work with the ideas. But The Way of the Ghost made a strong comeback and ended up being the main theme for the game.